So, documentary films, like I said, is non-fiction. Documentary films is camera shooting and recording reality. So, for a documentary filmmaker, reality or the world that he lives in becomes his raw material, which he, of course, edits and then he makes it into a film, a documentary film. One of the first films which was made within this form of documentary films, which helped us to understand what is the nature of documentary films and what is the role of documentary films, was a film called Nanook of the North. It was a film made by an ethnographer called Robert Flaherty. And of course, Robert Flaherty went into these wild areas of northern Canada and he lived with the Eskimos who existed and survived in harsh conditions. And he recorded their lives through the eyes of one single character called Nanook, who was an Eskimo. And through Nanook's story, he helps us as viewers to understand not just man's conflict with nature, but the harsh conditions in which Nanook lived and he survived. So, Nanook of the North is, in a sense, one of the first definitive documentary films which began a real interest among the people towards this form of cinema. Nanook of the North by Flaherty helped us to discover this form. This film was made in 1922, and of course, there's a lot of stories behind how Flaherty went himself, lived among the Eskimos, made friends with Nanook, and in a sense, made a film about Nanook. So, Nanook of the North in 1922 began the documentary film movement in a certain sense. And of course, from Nanook of the North, which inspired many other filmmakers to equally take cameras and go into reality and start shooting stories about reality. Now, I just gave out a word called stories, because I had told you that stories comes from the fictional world. But yes, stories also exist in the real world. So it was a story of Nanook. So what's the difference between non-fiction and fiction? There is stories in both, but in fiction, those stories are coming from an imaginary world of imaginary characters in an imaginary time and space. But in non-fiction, the stories are coming from real characters, from characters who really live in a real world. But there is a storytelling. So storytelling is there in both. But like I said, the material is different. In fictional film, the fictional filmmaker, he sets up the world. But in a documentary film, the real world becomes his set. So that is one definition. No, one Hitchcock once said that in fictional film, the director is God because he creates the world, he creates the characters, and he makes the story happen. But in non-fictional films, God is the director because the real world is the world which the God has made, and all the documentary filmmaker does is that he shoots this real world. So I hope this difference between fiction and non-fiction is clear, and for any understanding of documentary films, we begin not only with the earlier films that I mentioned of Lumiere brothers, the actualities, which were recording of real life, but in a true sense, the form of documentary film starts with Nanook of the North. So Nanook of the North is going to be our first major viewing, which we will watch, and then of course we'll try and see how Flaherty makes Nanook, and of course how he treats that reality that he encounters. And from Nanook of the North, as other filmmakers got attracted to this form of films or to this form of cinema, documentary film history begins. So our history is going to begin with Nanook of the North, and of course it'll end in the present day, where documentary films has become such successful activity. There are so many documentary films being made. There are so many stories about real characters, real lives that we encounter. Of course, primarily through television, because we still don't go and see documentary films in theaters. But like I said, it's a very, very important and an equally interesting and an equally exciting kind of cinema.